It's great to see everyone here. We've been looking forward to this day for quite a while. The other day I was reading through the book of Joshua, and as I was reading through it, I saw how it related to the days of unleavened bread. The point that I saw there was that God blesses those. Oh, how's that? Better. All right. I should have turned it on. But the point is that God blesses those who keep His commandments. Now, before we were married, Pam and I discussed a lot of things, as you can imagine. We talked and talked. Well, one thing that we discussed was tithing. And we were both deep in debt. Deep in debt. We had come out of divorces and we were deep in debt. But the one thing that we knew was that tithing was the right thing to do. It was the right thing to do. So we made a decision at that moment to tithe no matter what. And God honored that decision. And within 2 years, we were able to pay all of our bills and to build up our credit rating. It was amazing. Miraculous, matter of fact. The point is that God blesses those who keep His commandments. Now let's turn to Exodus chapter 19, verse 5. And verse 5 and 6. Exodus 19, beginning in verse 5. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people. For all the earth is mine, and you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation to me. Now God said that, and for 40 years, ancient Israel was wandering through the desert, and they were slowly learning to obey God. Obviously, they made a lot of mistakes, but they were learning. And they saw that He was faithful to provide them with quail, with manna, and with water. God was with Israel. He was in the pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night. His desire for them was to be the model nation for the world. And He wanted to place them at the crossroads of Egypt, and Greece, and Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, if, and this is important, if they obeyed Him. Under Joshua's leadership, Israel obeyed God in 4 critical areas. And that helped to set the stage and get them in the right frame of mind, the right attitude. And that ultimately culminated with the fall of Jericho. And then after that, the conquest of Canaan. So I want to review those 4 areas of Israel's obedience just before the Battle of Jericho. The very first thing is that Israel obeyed God to cross the Jordan River at flood stage. Let's turn to Joshua chapter 3, verses 14 through 17. Pam, could you bring me my water, please? I get dry quick. Joshua chapter 3, beginning in verse 14, says, So it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan, with the priest bearing, with the priest bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and those who bore the Ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priest who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water, for the Jordan overflows all its banks during the time of harvest, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap very far away at Adam, a city that is beside Zaratan. So the waters that went down into the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, failed and were cut off. And the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the ark of the covenant of the Eternal stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. Now remember that most of the Israelites did not come out of Egypt, but were born in the wilderness. There were a few who remembered when God parted the Red Sea so they could pass through it. The Jordan River crossing was a little different from the Red Sea crossing. The river was flooding. It was moving. Could you imagine stepping into a flooding river that could wash you away? It was flooding and moving until the priest bearing the ark moved forward, obeyed God in faith, and stepped into the water. Only then were the children of Israel able to cross the Jordan River on dry ground. God blessed them because of their obedience. The second thing, Israel obeyed God by circumcising all their males. That was the next thing that happened. Let's pick up the story in Joshua 5, verses 2 through 5. Just read a couple verses here. Joshua 5, beginning in verse 2. At that time, the Eternal said to Joshua, "Make flint knives for yourselves and circumcise the sons of Israel again the second time." And then skip down to verse 5. For all the people who came out had been circumcised, but all the people born in the wilderness on the way as they came out of Egypt had not been circumcised. So during their time in the wilderness, all the Israelites over 20 who had been circumcised in Egypt had died due to their disobedience and their lack of faith in God's promises, except two, Joshua and Caleb. The second generation of Israelites who were born in the wilderness had not been circumcised. But before entering the promised land, they followed God's command to undergo circumcision. Now, this act took faith. Imagine the situation. Here they are in enemy territory, and they would have been left vulnerable to attack for several days while they healed. But God blessed them because of their obedience. He reminded them of that covenant that they had, and the circumcision was the sign of that covenant. Number 3, Israel blessed God, or God blessed, Israel obeyed God to keep the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and God blessed them. Let's skip down to verse 10. Chapter 5, verse 10. It says, "Now the children of Israel camped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at twilight on the plains of Jericho." Now, as we read the story of Joshua, it seems that they kept the Passover soon after they crossed the Jordan. Now, we can't tell exactly how much time passed. It doesn't say. But the sense is that it came right after they crossed, right after they were circumcised, and now they're keeping the Passover. But in Exodus 12, if you think about it, what did they have to do 4 days before the Passover? Anybody know? The Passover's on the 14th of Nisan. On the 10th, they had to put up the lamb. They had to select a spotless lamb, and they had to separate it and keep it for 4 days. Well, how did that all play into this? They had to make those plans. They had to not only select a lamb, but they also had to do a count. They had to do a count so that if your family was too small to eat a whole lamb in one night, then you would gather together with another family. And they were commanded to make a count to see if the household could eat the entire lamb in one meal. None could be left for the morning. Anything that was left over had to be burned. So, one household might be, or two or three might gather together to keep the Passover. Now consider for a moment the tribes of Reuben, Gad, and half the tribe of Manasseh. What was different about them? They were allotted land on the east side of the Jordan. And they had agreed that if they were given that land, then they would provide places for their families, and the men of war would cross over with the rest of Israel and help with the conquest of Canaan. So they had to take that into account if they knew that Passover was coming up. If it was the next few days, we don't know exactly, but if it was, then they would have had to take that into account. What were they going to do? Were those men going to keep the Passover with some of the other Israelites? Were they going to gather together? Were they going to take some of their lambs and cross over the river with them? The other tribes would have taken their animals with them, and they could have chosen then. But all those plans had to be made. All this was part of being faithful to God. They knew what was involved. For 40 years, they'd been doing this. Here they are in the midst of crossing into enemy territory, preparing to face formidable enemies and fortified cities, but their minds were on obeying God's commands. That was what was important. As we read the story of the fall of Jericho, we have to keep all these consider all these things, because all of these were setting the stage for that victory. Israel knew that Jericho was a formidable enemy, a formidable task to take that city. But they also knew that after Jericho, there were lots of other cities to take, lots of other kings and battles to face. Joshua 12:24 tells us that altogether, Israel, through the leadership of Joshua, defeated 31 kings. So that's what they were facing. So before they crossed the Jordan in the acacia grove, God was preparing them to cross the river, and then to circumcise their men, and then to observe the Passover, all before confronting Jericho. All these commands served as reminders of God's power and the covenant he established with Abraham, which they were about to inherit. Israel needed all those reminders. Why did God command us to keep the Passover? Why did God command us to keep the holy days? They serve as a reminder of the miraculous power of God that he displayed over the Egyptians. But more importantly, it was a memorial of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ, our Passover lamb, who voluntarily died in our place. By obeying God's command to observe the Passover, we remember and acknowledge his power and his plan and his great love for us. Now, God gives us one more little detail in the middle of this story. Now, we know that year that the Passover was on a weekly Sabbath. You say, well, how do you know that? How do you know that? And why is it important? What difference does it make? Well, let's read a few verses, and I'll get to why it's important in a second. Let's go to Joshua chapter 5 and verse 11. Next thing that happened. And they ate the produce of the land on the day after the Passover, unleavened bread and parched grain on the very same day. Okay? Now let's turn back to Leviticus chapter 23, verses 11 and 14. This is what God commanded to be done during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Leviticus 23, verse 11. He, the priest, shall wave the sheaf before the Eternal to be accepted on your behalf. On the day after the Sabbath shall he wave it. Okay? The day after the Sabbath. Now let's look at verse 14. You shall eat neither bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain, until the same day that you have brought an offering to your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. You notice anything there? They ate the land's produce the day after the Passover, but they could not eat the land's produce until the wave sheaf was offered. The wave sheaf offering was always made the day after the weekly Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So the Passover and the Sabbath refer to the same day. The Passover had to be on a weekly Sabbath. The day after the Passover was what? Today, the first day of unleavened bread. That year, the wave sheaf was offered on the first day of unleavened bread. Now, why is this important? What difference does it make? Well, let's look at another passage here, or another verse or two. Let's look at Leviticus 23, verses 15 and 16. And you shall count for yourselves from the day after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be completed. Count 50 days to the day after the 7th Sabbath, then you shall offer a new grain offering to the Eternal. Now, what's that referring to? Pentecost. So if we don't get the wave sheaf day figured out right, we don't get Pentecost figured out right. What happens on years that the Passover falls on the weekly Sabbath? It's kind of a tough one, isn't it? If the Passover is a weekly Sabbath, the last day of unleavened bread is also a weekly Sabbath. So which Sabbath do you use? Okay? The next day after the last day of unleavened bread is no longer in the feast. So you can't use that one. But rather than just use that reasoning, we can look at this example. We know that this time, this is what they did. This text from Joshua tells us that if the Passover is a Sabbath, the wave sheaf offering is on the first day of unleavened bread. We don't have to guess. We don't have to figure it out. We know. We have an example right here. And there, we're to begin to count for Pentecost. Kind of an important thing. A little tidbit right in the middle of all this. Number 4. Israel obeyed God's plan for the battle of Jericho. So what happened next? What happened next? Again, we don't know exactly when or how much time had passed. But in Joshua 5:15, back in Joshua 5:15, the commander of the army of the Eternal met Joshua and said, "Take your sandal off your foot, for the place where you stand is holy." Remember when that God spoke to Moses at the burning bush, what did he say? The same thing. So we know that the commander of the army of the Eternal is the Lord himself. So what was the Lord's army? What was God's army made up of? It doesn't say. Well, what would it be? I gotta get another drink. Could it be that it was made up of angels? Makes the most sense to me. In 2 Kings 6:17, we have a story here where Elisha's servant got a glimpse of God's army. I won't go there and read it, but it says that he saw the mountain was full of the horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. Excuse me. Let's go forward. Let's go forward into chapter 6. Beginning in verse 1. Don't have to mic me up a little bit. It says, Now Jericho was securely shut up because of the children of Israel. None went out, none came in. And the Eternal said to Joshua, James, would you read this passage for me real quick? Come up here a minute. I've got it right here. Give me just a minute. If you'll just read this right here. Maybe I'll catch up.
Joshua 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was securely shut up because the children of Israel, none went out and none came in. Joshua 6, 2. And the Eternal said to Joshua, See, I have given Jericho into your hand, its king and its mighty men of valor. Joshua said, You shall march around the city, all you men of war. You shall do it all around the city once. This you shall do for 6 days. Verse 4. And 7 priests shall bear 7 trumpets of ram horns before the ark. But the 7th day you shall march around 7 times, and the priests shall blow the trumpets. Verse 5. It shall come to pass that when they make a long blast to the ram's horn, and when you hear the sound of the trumpet, all the people shall shout with a great shout, and then the wall of the city will fall down flat. And the people shall go up, every man straight before himself.
Thank you, James.
Better now.
Thank you. Better. How many have heard that story before?
Yeah.
So very familiar. Got online and looked, and according to gotquestions.org, the excavations that they discovered there at Jericho were of a fortified city, had a stone wall 11 feet high and 14 feet wide. At its top was a smooth stone slope, angling upward at 35 degrees for 35 feet. 35 feet. There it joined massive stone walls that towered even higher. So the walls of Jericho were at least 50 feet high. 50 feet high. And it was about a mile all the way around the city. The city looked impregnable. How could you attack that city? But here's the scene. Israel had been faithful. They'd obeyed God. They had passed through the flood at Jordan. The men had been healed, or were probably still healing from being circumcised. They kept the Passover on a weekly Sabbath while Jericho was only about a mile away. The wave sheaf was offered. They ate the fruit of the land, and the manna stopped on the first day of unleavened bread. Now, we can't be sure exactly when Joshua met the Lord, but perhaps it was right away. The text seems to indicate so. Maybe it was on Passover. Maybe it was on that first day of unleavened bread that he met him. If so, now we don't know, but if so, on that first day of unleavened bread, they marched out around the walls and back to the camp. Every day of the feast, then, if they were faithful, they were eating bread without leaven. The priest would have been teaching the people the truth of God and his character. Israel would have been spending time in prayer and listening as God's word was read. Israel would have been caring for one another as God commanded. And each day of the feast, they would march out of the city and around the city and back to the camp. The people of Jericho must have been frozen with fear. What in the world was Israel doing? They must have thought it was, what kind of a crazy plan is this to attack a city? They must have thought it was foolish. But Israel knew that God would bless their obedience. Then when the seventh day came, it would have been, again, the weekly Sabbath and the last day of unleavened bread, a holy day. Let's pick up the story in verse 15. But it came to pass on the seventh day that they rose early, about the dawning of the day, and marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. On that day only, they marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened when the priest blew the trumpets that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Eternal has given the city." So the people, go down to verse 20. So the people shouted when the priest blew the trumpets. And it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet and the people shouted with a great shout that the wall fell down flat. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him, and they took the city. And they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword. What a story. When we read that story, we must know, absolutely know, that God blesses those who keep his commandments. Like Israel, we face enemies. And as the tribulation comes upon us, we will face many more. Today, we face the pressures of this evil world ruled by Satan. Jeff's handing out some handouts. I forgot to tell him to. These are kind of the description of those days and how it fell within the days of unleavened bread. Thank you for passing those out. Today, we face pressures of this evil world ruled by Satan. We face our human natures. We face the sin that so easily besets us. As hard as it may be to believe, our enemies may become the members of our own families. They may be driven by fear. We may be persecuted for our faith. Will we stand strong? Will we be able to follow God even if it means pain and danger? Will we continue to keep his feasts in a hostile world? Will we be able to face a situation which seems impossible? Will we be able to stand before the kings and battle the power of Satan as we testify about God's truth? Will we remember how God displayed his power in the past? Will we make every effort to obey God and carry out his commands? The answer should be yes. But only if we develop our faith in God right now. If we're ready when the time comes, if we're faithful, God will bless us and use us to do his work and give us victory over our enemies.